Today we'll have a look at pivot tables. It is a functionality that allows you to create a report by just a few clicks. This functionality of Excel is very useful, especially for professionals who need to gather data and make reports quickly to be able to report them. On your screen on the left you will see the table we will use to create a pivot table. This table will have the revenue per salesperson per country on a certain date, and on the right hand side you can see one of the outputs that you will be able to create yourself after this video. So let's start straight away with our example of a pivot table. You can see right now, as discussed before, the table that we will be using as an input for our pivot table. On column A we have the revenue in US dollars, in column D the date of when the revenue was generated, in column B we have the salesperson names, and column C lastly we have the country where the revenue was generated. Now let's create a pivot table. Click on the insert button on the ribbon and then on pivot table, as you can see on the screen on the left side of the screen. Now you will get a pop-up. On the pop-up, one of the first fields we need to define is the table or range that will be used for our pivot table as a source. So if you click on this arrow, you can define by clicking and dragging the table that you want to use for in your pivot table. When you click on this button, you can go back to the pop-up. Then I will skip some fields that are more for advanced users, but in this case you have to select whether or not you want a new worksheet that will display your pivot table. In this case I will do that, and you can finalize by clicking OK. Right now we have a pivot table worksheet. As you can see, in this case it is called sheet 2, but of course you can name it whatever as you would name other sheets too. So in this case I will name it pivot table, and on the right you will see the pivot table menu. It says here pivot table fields. These fields are basically the column names of the source table. Here on the downside of the right side of the screen you can see 4 quadrants. You can basically click and drag your pivot table fields into these quadrants. The first one is a filter, the second one is a column, the third one is a row, the fourth one is a value. Now just to start a simple exercise, let's start by dragging the salesperson to the rows quadrant. Let's drag the revenue to the values quadrant, and let's drag the country to the columns quadrant. As you can see on the left hand side, Excel has generated automatically a pivot table, and we can see as rows we have the salesperson names, as columns we have the countries in which revenue was generated, and as values in this metrics table we can see the values of the revenue generated per salesperson in a certain country. Then of course you can finalize your report by adjusting the format to your liking. In this case I'm changing the format from euro to dollars, and I'm applying an accounting format so that the revenue is easier to read. As you can see, just in a few minutes you can have a report thanks to the pivot table function, and you're ready to go. You can send your email to report the figures. Now if you right click on one of the fields that you use in your pivot quadrant, you can adjust the field settings, and as you can see here, from instead calculating the sum of the turnover, you can also choose to display an average of the revenue by salesperson per country. So it's really easy to adjust your report by just another few clicks. If we go to the field settings again, you can display the maximum value per salesperson per country. So it's really easy and interactive way to adjust your reports. You can choose a sum again to have the total revenue. Now let's drag the country instead of from the columns to the rows. You can see it will adjust your view of the report accordingly. Now you see a row for each country with a drop-down list of every salesperson active in those countries generating the revenues. Now let's drag the date to the columns quadrant. As you can see, now we get an overview per column per month. So the revenue generated per month per salesperson. It's an interesting view to see the evolution and recognize how the revenue adjusts per season or certain months. You can click on the plus sign to see more specific dates and the revenues generated in those dates. Now moving on, you can also drag a date field or another field to the filters quadrant, and now, as you can see on the visual of the report on the left, you will see an extra row for the filters. Now we can select a specific date to apply it into our table below. For instance, let's type down Feb, and then we will have selected all the values only for February. Now we see the revenue generated by salesperson per country in the month of February. Now of course you can add whichever field you want to the filter quadrant, and you can use it to filter down your report on the left. Now let's add another month to our selection. You can do this by clicking again to the filter button. Let's type down, for instance, Jan of January, so we can be sure that everything of January will be selected, and click on add current selection. And as you can see, we have an overview between the 2 months, January and February. It's a really versatile functionality of Excel, which is really useful to save time and making reports in just a few clicks. If you want, you can also show percentages instead of values. In this case, let's show the percentage of share of revenue generated by salesperson, so we can see which salesperson has generated the most revenue. You can do this by right-clicking on one of the values which are in your table, and then you can go to show value as, and for example percentage of column total, and now we can see that Joe has the most share of revenue generated. So it is the salesperson who has sold the most compared to the others. Of course, if you apply a filter, it will adjust the percentages, so we can see on a general note, Joe is still the salesperson who has sold the most. Now if we drag down the country to the columns, you can see the pivot table will adapt as we are used to it, and we will keep the percentages. Here we can see that Anne generated the whole revenue for the UK, and the USA we can see that Carol generated 49.03% of the revenue for the USA, and the other half is generated by Joe. I hope this video was helpful to you and you learned something. If you have any remarks or feedback, do not hesitate to put them on the comments down below. Subscribe to see more videos on my channel. I even have an Excel playlist with a lot of videos, so make sure to check those out also. Take care, and I will see you soon.